Svay Pak is a small village north of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, where most of the residents are ethnic Vietnamese who live in poverty and marginalization. The village has been notorious for being a destination for adult and child prostitution, especially for foreign pedophiles who seek young girls as young as 5 years old. How did this happen actually? Why did some mothers sell their own daughters to brothels and pimps? What happened to the victims and the perpetrators? To understand how Svay Pak became a child sex trafficking hotspot, we need to look at the history and culture of Cambodia. Cambodia is a country that suffered from decades of war, genocide, poverty, and corruption. Between 1975 and 1979, the communist regime of Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge killed about 2 million people, or a quarter of the population, in a brutal attempt to create an agrarian utopia. They also destroyed the religious, educational, and social institutions of the country, leaving behind a traumatized and broken society. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia was occupied by Vietnam until 1989 and then plunged into a civil war until 1998. During this time, Cambodia became a destination for sex tourism, especially for pedophiles who exploited the vulnerability and desperation of the people. Svay Pak was originally a fishing village, but in the 1990s, it became a hub for child sex tourism as the demand for young girls increased among foreign tourists, mainly from Western countries, Australia, Japan, and Korea. The village was also known as Kilometer 11 or K11 because it was located 11 kilometers from the center of Phnom Penh. The village had hundreds of brothels where girls were kept in cages or rooms and were forced to service up to 20 clients a day. The price for a girl ranged from $5 to $200 depending on her age. One of the main factors was poverty. Many families in Svay Pak lived in extreme poverty and struggled to meet their basic needs. Some of them borrowed money from loan sharks or brokers who charged high interest rates and used threats or violence to collect their debts. Some mothers felt they had no other choice but to sell their daughters as virginity or force them to work in brothels to repay their debts or earn some income. Some mothers also believed that their daughters would have a better life or find a rich husband if they worked in the sex industry. One of the most shocking examples of how poverty and debt can drive some mothers to sell their own daughters into slavery is the case of Svay Pak. Svay Pak was only 13 years old when her mother, Anne, sold her virginity for $800 to a man who raped her for 3 nights in a hotel room. Anne said she did it because she had taken out a loan that spiraled to about $6,000 in debt, and she was threatened by the moneylenders. She also said she regretted her decision and that she didn't know what would happen to her daughter. But after Svay Pak returned home, her mother began pressuring her to work in a brothel. Svay Pak refused and ran away from home. She was eventually rescued by an anti-trafficking organization called Agape International Missions, or AIM, which helped her recover from her trauma and find a decent job making bracelets and clothing in a factory run by AIM. Corruption was another factor in this trafficking. It was widespread among police, judges, and other officials who accepted bribes from traffickers, brothel owners, or sex offenders to ignore or facilitate their crimes. According to a report by ECPAT International, corruption was one of the main challenges in combating child sexual exploitation in Cambodia, as it undermined the rule of law and the protection of victims' rights. The report stated that corruption occurred at all levels of the criminal justice system, from the initial investigation to the final verdict. Some officials were also directly involved in trafficking or exploiting children for sex. For example, in 2021, a former governor of Siem Reap province was arrested for allegedly raping 6 underage girls. In another case in 2020, a former deputy police chief of Phnom Penh was sentenced to 25 years in prison for running a child prostitution ring. These cases were rare exceptions, as most complicit officials enjoyed impunity and faced no consequences for their actions. This created a culture of impunity and a lack of trust in the authorities among the victims and their families. Many victims didn't report their abuse or cooperate with the prosecution, fearing retaliation, stigma, or further exploitation by corrupt officials. Some victims were even threatened or coerced by the police to drop their complaints or testify in favor of the traffickers. Another factor that made Cambodian children particularly vulnerable to adult predators was the culture of obedience and deference to elders. According to a report by ECPAT International, an organization that fights against child sexual exploitation, Cambodian children are expected to abide by rules set by adults, and saying no to an adult is not easily tolerable. This made it easier for traffickers and pimps to manipulate and coerce children into prostitution. Some parents also viewed their children as property or commodities that could be sold or exchanged for money or goods. Some Cambodians also believed in the concept of karma, which means that one's fate is determined by one's actions in previous lives. This might lead some victims or their families to accept their situation as a result of bad karma or fate. One more factor was the lack of education among many families, especially the ethnic Vietnamese minority who lived in Svay Pak. Many ethnic Vietnamese families face discrimination and exclusion from the public education system, which is based on the Khmer language and culture. Many of them couldn't afford to send their children to private schools or non-formal education systems. As a result, many children in Svay Pak grew up illiterate or unaware of their rights and opportunities. They also lacked the skills and knowledge to find decent jobs or even escape poverty. This made them more vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking by pimps and brothel owners who preyed upon their desperation and ignorance. So how did these mothers sell their daughters to traffickers? Some of the mothers were approached by traffickers who offered them large sums of money for their daughters' virginity. Others were coerced by moneylenders or husbands who threatened them with violence or abandonment. Some of the mothers even believed that selling their daughters was a way to secure their future, as they hoped the buyers would take care of them or even marry them. The process of selling their daughters involved several steps. First, the mothers had to find a buyer either through a broker, a friend, or a relative. The buyers were usually foreign men who came to Svay Pak looking for young girls. They paid between $500 and $5,000 for a girl's virginity, depending on her age and appearance. Then, the mothers had to take their daughters to a hospital or a clinic where they were issued a certificate confirming their virginity. This certificate increased the price of the girls, as virginity was highly valued by the buyers. It also gave them a false sense of security that the girls were free from diseases. After that, the mothers had to deliver their daughters to the buyers, who usually took them to hotels or guest houses for several days or weeks. During this time, the girls were repeatedly raped and abused by the buyers, who often filmed or photographed them for their own pleasure or profit. The situation in Svay Pak has attracted international attention and condemnation from human rights groups, media outlets, and governments. Several efforts have been made to combat child sex trafficking in Cambodia, such as law enforcement aids, awareness campaigns, prevention programs, rehabilitation centers, and legal reforms. However, these efforts have faced many challenges and limitations, such as corruption, impunity, lack of resources, lack of coordination, lack of evidence, lack of trust, lack of alternatives, and lack of potential will. One of the organizations that has been working tirelessly to fight child sex trafficking in Svay Pak is AIM, founded by Don Brewster, a former pastor from the United States. AIM has rescued more than 700 people from the sex trade since 2005 and provided them with shelter, counseling, education, vocational training, and employment opportunities. AIM has also been involved in arresting and prosecuting traffickers and pimps, as well as educating and empowering the local community to prevent and report child sexual exploitation. Brewster says the situation in Svay Pak has improved significantly since he started his work there. He says that before, almost every girl born in Svay Pak was destined to be trafficked, but now the percentage has dropped to below 50%. He also says that the brothels in Svay Pak have been shut down, and now the sex trade has moved to hotels or other locations where it's harder to detect and intervene. However, Brewster also warns that the problem is not over and that there's still a lot of work to be done. He says that the demand for child sex is still high and that the traffickers and pimps are still active and adaptable. He says that the root causes of child sex trafficking, such as poverty, debt, ignorance, and greed, are still present and need to be addressed. He says that the only way to end child sex trafficking is to change the hearts and minds of the people who are involved in it or affected by it. In conclusion, the victims of child sex trafficking suffered unimaginable physical and psychological harm, while the perpetrators enjoyed impunity and profit. The fight against child sex trafficking is not over, and it requires the commitment and cooperation of all stakeholders, from governments to NGOs to communities to individuals. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget to leave a comment down below and let us know what you thought about this topic. See you next time.